Welcome to Inside Chats 14. It's great to have you all here tonight. The tube strikes are off, so that's good. And yeah, it's great to be here tonight. We are going, I think, for the first time to touch a little bit more about media research. And today we have amazing speaker Graeme, so it's really a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
No worries. And can you, for the start, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your career so far, and also the IPA as well?
Yes. Okay. So, how far back to go? So we were talking about this before. I can go back to the beginning, and I started life as a chef actually. So that's interesting. If you need any recipe tips afterwards, please come and see me. But and realised quite quickly within that profession that I wasn't going to get anywhere that I wanted to be. So I went back to university and then was a mature student, even though I was only in my very early 20s. And whilst doing that course, I did psychology, I realised that research and insight was really something that I wanted to get into. So, but sadly I'd missed my the graduate programmes. So I was too old to go onto the graduate program, so I had to start somewhere. So I started off as a telephone interviewer, and I did a lot of interviewing work, which, to be honest, from a researcher's perspective, is a fantastic grounding in research generally. If you ever get an opportunity to go out with someone researching, knocking on doors, or work on a telephone, I heartily recommend it because it gives you the deepest insight into what we put our participants through and how to design questionnaires. So I did that for a while and then managed to sort of progress up, and I was given a break to work upstairs, metaphorically and physically, upstairs in the exec suite, working on a project. And that was the start of my journey, and we were doing IT research. That was for IBM. And then I sort of moved on from there and worked for Kantar Media. And that was, in Kantar, they work in sort of columns and in different disciplines. And so I was working in the media division mainly for media clients, media owners like the BBC and ITV and newspaper owners. And then sort of fell into audience measurement, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later, when Kantar won the Barb contract. So I worked in that for a number of years and found that was sort of a real passion for me, was audience measurement, and how the audience measurement and the currencies that operate within the UK underpin the whole advertising industry. And without them, there wouldn't be an advertising ecosystem. They're so central to making sure that everybody agrees on certain standards within audience measurement. So, and that led me on to Ipsos and then to the IPA. And for those of you that don't know the IPA, we're the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. We are the trade body for the advertising agency world. We do everything that you would expect a trade body to do, which is we provide training, we provide legal services, best practice, benchmark reports, all that kind of stuff for our members. And we represent I think we say about 90% of UK advertising spend goes through IPA member agencies. So we're very, very big, very well established, over 100 years old. And I joined as head of research at the IPA. So that's who I am.
Amazing. Okay, so let's maybe start with the fundamentals of media research. So let's lay the ground. So what is media research from your point of view, and how should we define it?
Such a big question. Thank you. That's just one of the biggest things. Well, I think there are two ways to define media research. So there is the sort of standard ad hoc research that you'd have, which is measuring different types of consumers for a media owner. So yes, organisations like the BBC and ITV, or like the Daily Mail, or JCDecaux Outdoor, those organisations are looking at doing their own media research. And they're also sort of consumer-based research that looks at how people are using different types of media and what they think about media. So that's sort of your normal ad hoc media, or you might have a tracking survey looking at your consumers of your particular media and how they're using your media. So there's that side of it, and then there's the other side of it that I touched on before, which is the currency side of it, and that's audience measurement, and that's the really robust methods of counting the number of people that are watching a particular program, reading a particular newspaper or article online, or listening to a radio station, or listening to a podcast, or viewing different websites. So that's a much more fundamental, centralized system of audience measurement. That's how I define media measurement, media research.
That was yeah.
Is that broad enough for you?
It is.
Let's unpack that. And I think maybe again going back to the start.
Cooking?
Maybe not that.
No. Okay, not back to that start. Okay, fine. That's fine.
I would imagine as your career evolved, you narrowed and narrowed your focus. Mm-hmm. So how did you end up in media research?
So that was a journey sort of through technology and also wanting to avoid FMCG, and nothing against anybody that works in FMCG, but whenever you think about market research, you think about, certainly I did when I was younger, think about how many people buy chewing gum, that kind of thing. It never really excited me very much. So when the first sort of research company I joined was a company called Ronin, still around at the moment. They're an international transatlantic organisation. Does they know Ronin? Yes. Yes. So they gave me my break. So I started there as a telephone interviewer and worked up, and that's where I got my first sort of exec job, working on an IBM account there, which gave me the opportunity to travel to America, which was fantastic. So they're a really, really good organisation. And so I was doing IT sort of research there around not terribly interesting stuff for IBM around routers and servers and stuff like that. And I mean, there was telephone interviews amongst IT managers of like an hour and a half long, which would shock me now. But actually, when you speak to an IT manager and you ask them about the number of routers they've got on their network, they're just absolutely desperate to tell you all there is to know about their systems. So it wasn't hard to get them, but it was a slog. But that sort of fitted well into my natural likes, which is around sort of technology and that kind of stuff. So, and then a position came up in Kantar Media, and I was just sort of looking around for various roles, and I think I just really landed on my feet with Kantar Media because it really hit home the kind of research that I really love doing, which was around media consumption, and we're all consumers of media, and so any sort of research that talks about how and why people do different things around media. Why are they watching certain things? Why do they read the Daily Mail opposed to the Telegraph? And that kind of stuff was all really, really interesting to me. And so I spent 15 years at Kantar Media through various guises and various iterations. It was RSGB when I first joined, and then TNS, and then Kantar Media. And then through sort of a quirk of fate, really, that the contract I was working on moved to Ipsos. I transferred over to Ipsos and worked there for a number of years and started to get more ingrained in audience measurement. So while I was at Ipsos, I worked on PAMCO, which is for the audience measurement for newspapers and print. I did a little bit on Root, which is out of home. I did a bit on UCOM, was their Iris account, and also some stuff on Radar primarily, which is where I sort of ended up running the Radar account, which is for radio. So that sort of honed my desire and my interest in audience measurement, and that's when I was, fortunate enough to be sort of picked up really by the IPA because the IPA, when I talked before about them being the trade body, what the IPA does is it represents our members on all of those currencies that I talked about. So the way the currencies operate is a central sort of committee system, and on that committee sit all of the parties involved, so buy side and sell side, to make sure that the data that's produced is as robust as it can be. And from our perspective, we represent advertising agencies. You can't have all of the agencies sitting on all of these committees, so we are the voice for them on those committees.
Okay, so you're in this space for quite some time, we can say, but so how the media research changed throughout the years?
It's gone online. So that's probably the fundamental, and I am sort of old enough to remember when online first started, and I'm certainly not against online. So, online has been a fantastic methodology, new methodology that we've been able to embrace, and if anything, it's democratized, I think, research in the same way that the social media platforms opened up the advertising space to new entrants. So I always like to think about those operations as being the rare instance of growing the pie rather than just slicing the pie up more, because there's so many fewer barriers to entry, and online research I think is very much like that in terms of it allowed much smaller players to be able to do conduct their own research, which they wouldn't have been able to do before. When I first started, you had to go to an organisation like Kantar or Ipsos and buy a full service package to do your research, and so it was only really available to larger organisations, whereas nowadays you can do very, very quick, very, very cheap and effective online research. So I think that's probably up till now. I mean, a couple of years, in the last few years, there's been obviously some really fundamental changes around AI that we can talk about. But up till then, I think online research has been the most fundamental shift that we've seen in all forms of research, not just media research.
And how have the standards changed? So the tracking media effectiveness, I see with the advent of the internet, how has that changed within the industry?
So it's a difficult question to answer because the online research particularly is troubled by a lot of biases within it, in its nature. A lot of biases that can be overcome or can be ignored, depending on the type of research that you're doing, but are always going to be present. And so the change in terms of the quality standards has been initially, I think there was a significant drop in standards when online first came on, because it was overused and it thought that it was sort of a panacea for all ills and it could just solve all of our problems. And people quickly realised that the inherent biases with online research, some of them can't be overcome. And so we thought it was going to replace all of types of research, and the face-to-face was going to go, and there was going to be no telephone research or anything like that. And that transpired to not be the case. They all prevailed, but the standards are getting, I think, much better, and have got a lot better over the last sort of decade of using online research, where people are much more familiar with some of the biases that are inherent in that and are able to overcome them or adjust for them or account for them in their methodology when they're planning. So we talk about media research, and one of the biggest challenges that people don't necessarily appreciate when you talk about online research is that online is a media, and it's very difficult to use one media to measure another media, because immediately you're introducing some biases into that. And if the obvious example would be something like newspapers. It's very difficult to measure how many people read a physical newspaper by using an online system, because first of all, your online panel, they're all online. I mean, it sounds obvious, but every single person you speak to has an online account, an online presence. And not only that, they're probably online for a lot of their time, because they're on a panel, so they're going to be quite frequent internet users. So when you just take that sort of bias and you apply that to something like newspaper readership, which is quite a traditional approach and is generally an older pursuit, well, then you're immediately disenfranchising or excluding a large sector of your potential population. So in terms of those sort of standards, it's about being mindful of those biases and making sure that you can account for them in your work.
And how do you mitigate for some of those biases?
You use different sample sources, and you do use mixed methodology. So I think for a lot of the work that people are doing for online research, it doesn't matter. It's fine. If you're looking at how many people are consuming cornflakes, it probably doesn't matter that you're using an online panel. It really doesn't. It's going to be absolutely fine and give you a really fair representation of your audience. But if you're looking at something where online activity is a driver for a behaviour or for a type of consumption or that, then you're going to have to look outside of that box and look elsewhere for either different sources of sample or using different methodologies to feed into that. Or what you can do, which people don't do enough of, is just be open and honest about the methodology that you used and the limitation of the universe that you've approached. So don't claim that it's nationally representative, claim that it's a representative of the online population, which you do see. And if you can say that, then you're immediately sort of absolving yourself and saying, well, we don't include the offline population, this is only the online population, and then the reader can interpret those results.
How often is face-to-face research still used these days?
In my line of work, all the time. But it is sort of now, for a number of reasons, and most of them come down to cost, it's primarily used for audience measurement currencies and social government work, really. There's very little consumer work that's done now face-to-face. It is a very challenging methodology to use. It's very expensive because it uses human beings. So all of the research methods that use human beings are much more expensive for obvious reasons. And so it can only really be used by those that have got big budgets.
Are those like intercepts, or those are like also visits to the homes, or both?
So both and all of those, and there's still some work that's done, intercepts in store, particularly when you're looking at geographical research, and if your sample is geographically focused. So if you want to do some work for a store, for instance, well then the best place is to position yourself outside that shop and wait for people to leave and then talk to them there. That's always going to be your best methodology, probably better than online, really. So there is still that kind of stuff goes on, but primarily the kind of work that we do in media is door-to-door knocking. It's still the classic of pounding the streets. The clipboard has been replaced by an iPad, but it's still door-to-door knocking, and whether that's a quota sample where you're just walking a certain set of streets and you're trying to knock on as many doors as you can to get the people, or whether that's a random probability where you've got named addresses, but that's still, and there's still a lot of individuals that do that work, and it's a great line of work for people, but it's being limited now. Again, because of the limited amount of work, it's limited to companies like Kantar, Ipsos and NatSen are really the three organisations that have reasonable field forces, because it's difficult to maintain those. You've got to give them enough work to do.
Those are like hardcore, like skills, door to door going.
It's really hard, sort of salesman type tactics. There's a lot of rejections, a lot of door slamming, a lot of swearing, and that you've got to just put up with. It is, but it remains, as far as I'm concerned anyway, the way to get the best, most robust samples. So if you're looking for something and it really matters who you speak to and getting a representative sample, there is no better way than doing face-to-face.
What about phone research?
So there is still some of that goes on, and in fact my own organisation uses phone research a lot. So we have the IPA runs a project called Touchpoints, and that is primarily telephone-based recruitment, and it's a mobile diary app that we ask people to complete over 7 days. It's a multimedia measurement study with a lifestyle questionnaire, and we recruit those people over the phone, and it's very, very effective. But the reason we do that is because it's a halfway between online and face-to-face. So again, our objective on Touchpoints is to measure multimedia consumption. So we can't really use online to collect our sample to do that, because obviously that's going to massively disadvantage all of our offline media that we're trying to collect. So we try and use an offline method of recruitment, and telephone is cheaper than face-to-face. And you can achieve relatively large samples more cost effectively than you can face-to-face. And there are other organisations that still use it. Ronin, we talked about, still underpins a lot of their work by telephone. Telephone is particularly good for business to business as well. Getting through those gatekeepers, getting to speak to people. Nowadays, email research just doesn't cut through with business-to-business work, and you need to spend the time on the phones trying to get people.
How are those acceptance rates, or of the calls and stuff like that these days? Stuff like getting worse as well, or?
Yes, they are getting worse. I'm finding actually that we're coming slightly out of a bit of a dip. There was a real decline with the reduction in landlines, and that caused a lot of problems for sample providers for telephone work because they just couldn't adapt to the prevalence of mobile phones, and so we were getting a lower and lower and lower response rate, and they were trying to put out mobile phone numbers. So a lot of anybody that's used telephone will know that one of the primary methods of telephone sample source is RDD, which is random digit dialing. So that's where a sample provider will just literally generate a ton of numbers. So they'll use an area code and they'll randomly generate 10,000 numbers off that area code. And then they use a quite clever system of pinging all those numbers on that list to at least identify whether the number's are live, so they can get rid of a load of the sort of the chaff from it, and that's what they sell to you as a provider. So they were really struggling with mobile phones to try and do that exercise, and it took them a number of years to adapt a little bit, and they've got much better now. So the mobile sample now that comes through is much better than it's ever been. So there are real numbers, but you can't get over the fact of people not answering their phones. Research suppliers have had to adapt so that their numbers are now identifiable. They went through a phase when I was working in telephone research where your number would be unknown on the mobile phone. Nobody answers an unknown number. So now organisations like Ipsos make sure that the number is seen on a mobile phone, so that's the least that they can do. But response rates are still very low. It's like online research, it's a numbers game. You've got to put the calls in to get the numbers in. So, 10-15%, is fairly standard, I think.
Brilliant. And I think we were speaking earlier, you were saying that you're really a practitioner across 7 different types of research. Can you just speak about how you juggle that?
Well, it's 7 different sorts of currencies. So the media that we measure or that we represent. So and that is challenging, but it's also from our perspective sitting centrally quite an advantage, because there isn't any other organisation within the currency world that looks at audience measurement that has the overview the IPA has, because we sit on every single currency. So we're talking about Barb for television audience measurement, Radar for radio, PAMCO for newspaper readership, Root for out of home, all of those. So and they all have different approaches to how they track their audiences. We were talking before about Root is an interesting one because they carry GPS devices with Root, because Root for out of home, if you're trying to measure the likely audience for a poster in a street, well then you need to know who's walking past that poster, and in order to do that, people would probably say, well, can't you just put a camera or a counter on each of those posters and see who walks past it? Well, there's something like 250,000 posters in the UK. You can't practically do that. There's probably a lot more than that. Sorry, that's a massive understatement. When we look at different sizes and bus stops and internal, but you can't put a camera on all of those. So instead, you put a camera on a person effectively, and you give a sample a GPS device, and you track their movements. And when they pass a poster, it registers, and so the currency or the Root as an organisation can then determine how many people pass that and give you a demographic profile of every single poster. So that's a physical sample that's recruited. Barb is a television meter that goes onto someone's television set and sits in their home, and a panel is recruited to press buttons to say when they enter the room and when they leave for the demographic profile, and it monitors what's being watched on the television. So that's a completely different methodology as well. So it's being a sort of methodologist and a practitioner across all of those, you get a great overview of how different methodologies are used in different approaches, and that you've got to pick the right methodology for the right approach.
Of course, and I imagine it wasn't always 7, so some came and went over time. And are they methodologies within the currencies, are they also evolving quite quickly?
They absolutely are, and there's a great example at the moment of PAMCO. So PAMCO is one of the oldest currencies, slightly superseded, I think, by ABC, which is circulation figures for print media. But PAMCO, one of PAMCO's claims to fame actually is that it invented social grade. So, going back into its early days, it was actually the birth of social grade on PAMCO. Print media has struggled somewhat over the recent years, as we'll all imagine. I don't know anybody here that reads a physical newspaper. Anybody? You've got a couple? Yeah, that's good. Keep reading it. So there are still some, but if we'd have said 10 years ago, probably everybody would have put their hand up to say that they read a physical newspaper, particularly in London, where Metro was just enormous when it launched, and everybody would have read Metro and Evening Standard. But we're in times now where Evening Standard, for instance, is going once a week. That's the kind of position that we're in with printed media. So they've had to adapt, which means that there's a lack of money within the industry itself. So they've gone through a period of they were the sort of strongest face-to-face organisation, really. PAMCO, they had a really, really robust methodology. It was very expensive, so they had to reduce their costs, and they've looked at online, they've looked at bringing in different data sets. And what's happened just now, just sort of recently, is talking about mergers of different organisations. So they're coming on board with Barb, and they're joining forces to add PAMCO to a part of the Barb Establishment Survey, which is a 50,000 plus face-to-face survey that's done annually, and it looks at the demographic makeup of households, and it gives Barb an idea of what the television universe is within the UK. So PAMCO is joining forces with that, and they're combining their strengths, and that helps to reduce costs and provide a robust sample for both. So across all of the JICs, we are absolutely seeing a lot of movement and progression in looking at alternative methods as the marketplace changes.
Brilliant. And just one follow-up. How does money work behind that? So let's call it Barb or any one of the others. Who is it funded by, and who benefits from it?
So that's kind of at the heart of the beauty of the currency system in the UK, is that everybody funds it. And that's how it works, and it's funded proportionally, depending on the currencies. And the currencies are all sort of funded slightly differently, but ultimately at their heart, there is a buy side and a sell side funding structure. In a lot of cases, it's primarily the media owners that fund it and supply it to the industry, but in all cases, it's governed centrally, and everybody understands where the money comes from, and that money certainly does not buy influence around the table. The way that the currencies are set up is that everybody has to be represented around the table. So agencies are represented, the media owners are represented. In a lot of cases, ISBAR, the advertisers themselves, are represented as well. So everybody around that table determines how the data is going to be collected, how it's going to be processed, and how it's going to then be used. And that ultimately gives you what becomes, as we say, the currency of that media. So that advertising slot, that impression, that segment in Coronation Street has a monetary value, and everybody around that table has agreed that monetary value is a fair price to pay. So I think the most important thing is transparency around all of that. So around funding, around methodology, around data processing, there are no black boxes. Everything is open and transparent.
So the point of the body is to define how they are going to measure currency, right? And then everyone agrees, of course.
They sometimes don't.
Sometimes don't.
They try to agree, yes.
So how do providers then compete if they all do the same type of research? What's their added value?
The currencies themselves generally work on quite long contracts. That's again is a requirement, primarily because they tend to be quite expensive. So that allows the costs to be spread over a period of time and shared. So, but those contracts come up for renewal. At the moment, I'm going to say that Ipsos are the central provider for most of those currencies, and that's not necessarily by design. That's just Ipsos have sort of collated, if that's the right word, the contracts over time. They've just always put in really strong bids. But at the end of each of those contracts, they're up for tender, and any provider can put a tender forward to supply the services that are required for that. So the challenge that is always going to be the case for those is the cost of entry is so great for these currencies because they're so expensive that it can be quite difficult for a new entrant to come in and beat the incumbent who's got established systems set up and established things in place. But every contract renewal, they go out to tender and people can come in and pitch for those things. There was a recent tender from Root for out of home, and that was originally that was owned or run by just Ipsos, owned the whole thing, really. But what Root decided to do was to look at trying to separate that out, and maybe we can chunk that down, and maybe because it's such a big contract to try and give to somebody else, and the barrier to entry is so great for somebody to come in and try and take that over, that maybe we can split it up a bit and we can give bits to other people. So that does happen as well. But it's a cycle. It's always a cycle of sort of 3, 5 or 8 years, some of them are even.
Yeah. Okay. So are the jinx, are they the essential part of the media user research? Would you say like they are like the center of it?
100%. I mean, absolutely, unequivocally, yes, they are. In fact, the advertising market in the UK would be, we often liken it, I think, to the Wild West. It would be a free-for-all because it would be a case of advertisers, our members, particularly advertising agencies, would be buying space on behalf of their clients and using proprietary media owner data. And there would be no oversight on what that data represents, how it's been collected, and what the standards are that it's been that it represents. So, yes, I think having the system, and we've got, I would say, we've in the UK we've probably got one of the most mature advertising measurement systems in the world. I think in terms of how specific our measurement techniques are for each of the different media. So it is absolutely essential, I think, to everything that we do. And I would hope that even though the currencies themselves are almost invisible to most people that aren't necessarily in the industry, even our members, they're invisible to most of them as well. But that's fine because they're doing their job in terms of just making sure that the data that the whole industry is using that represents advertising currency is valid and robust and is what it should be.
And are there any black spots in measurement? Or I would imagine walled garden data tricky. I would imagine TikTok video analysis is also tricky. How did the bodies mitigate that?
So the walled garden data has always been a challenge, but organisations like UCOM and Ipsos's Iris can get around that because they use a panel. So you don't need the walled gardens permissions if you've got a panel and you're monitoring those individuals' activities, and that's what you're reporting on. So you're not reporting on census data necessarily from the media owners themselves in the sense of sort of Google and Meta and those likes. You're reporting the activity of your individual panel. So that's how they get around that kind of thing. The streamers are fairly straightforward. Barb has been measuring the streamers for quite a long time, even before the streamers were, to use the word allow is not the right word, but before they wanted themselves to be measured. And this is the same in America as well, in that you don't need the streamer's permission to audience measurement their output. Your panel is consuming their content, and so as long as you can measure that content, then you can report on that. Ultimately, the streamers I think wanted access to their data, to that audience measurement data, and so came on board with Barb. So and they see the value in what that gives them, because it gives them a level of demographics that they don't get necessarily from their own data, and that's what Barb will supply them with, is not just their viewing figures, but also the broad the demographics of who is watching that content. So there are ways around that, they are surmountable, but it's always been a challenge, the lack of data from the big social media platforms particularly.
Speaking of methods, which one is your favorite?
I don't think I have a favourite. I mean, I'm a big fan of face-to-face, and I'm a fan of face-to-face because I spend a lot of time with face-to-face interviewers. When I was running the Barb recruitment contract, our primary method was face-to-face, and I used to do the vast majority of our interviewer briefings, and so I really enjoy spending a lot of time with interviewers, and I just respect, going back to what we were saying before about just how tough face-to-face is, I really respect an individual that's willing to go out and knock on doors to get market research insight. It's not an easy thing to do, particularly for a lot of face-to-face work. There is no reward for the participant. We're moving more towards that nowadays, and we're giving better rewards, whether that be in terms of sort of 360 return on data and insights into their own behaviours, or whether that's actually just monetary rewards. We are doing better at that now, but when I was doing Barb, there was no financial reward for a person to give you their data on their doorstep. So imagine just how difficult that is for an interviewer to go and knock on a door and ask someone to just give up 15 minutes of their time for nothing. It's tough. So I think face-to-face probably just because of just the commitment that it takes from those interviewers, and I really respect
some
them.
charms for it. Yeah. So do you have some tips on which methods to choose for media research?
I think the first thing is probably going back to what I said before about being wary of that, using a media to measure a media. So just being aware of what the bias is that something like online research introduces. That's also similar for other methods as well. They've all got their own biases. Telephone has its own biases in terms of who is prepared to pick up your phone, pick up the phone and answer your call. And just basic respondent bias is prevalent in all of research anyway. And door knocking, face-to-face, who's at home. If you're not balancing your call times to allow for working people, then you're just going to get people that are at home. And also the individual that you speak to when you're doing a sample like face-to-face, are you speaking to the person that always answers the door? Who is it in your house that answers the door? In my house, that's me, that always answers the door. So you're always going to get me. You're not going to get my wife. When you're choosing methodology, I think it's just trying to be aware of. You don't have to be a specialist in bias, especially a psychoanalyst or psychologist in psychological biases. Just think about practically what is that methodology and who is going to be excluded at a simple level by the use of that method. And if the people that are going to be excluded are a minority of your universe that you're trying to target, then it shouldn't be a problem too much, as long as you sort of can account for that within your quotering. Just being aware of what you're doing and who's not part of your sample.
Brilliant. How do you see AI changing the industry?
Right. It's really tough because we're really at the beginning of AI, particularly in market research terms and insight gathering. There's obviously it's going to permeate, I think, everything that we do. I mean, right from writing questionnaires, or even before that, writing briefs and writing responses to briefs. It's going to be, it's going to transform that into writing basic questionnaires, which is already very, very proficient at doing. I've used it for writing questions in the past as well. So it's really good at that kind of stuff already. The sort of next steps that we're just starting to see the beginnings of are when we're looking at generating whole questionnaires based on sort of topics, but then also perhaps slightly more scary is when we start looking at generating responses. And I think we're going to start seeing that more and more in terms of sort of two different ways, I think, of approaching responses. That I've already seen models that can do this, where you'll have a questionnaire that you've asked a cohort, a sample of, and you've got all of your responses from that. It's starting to, yeah, it's getting annoyed at me already. Sorry. They may well do. So yeah, you've done your survey and you've got your questionnaire, and it was a 10-minute questionnaire, and you've got all your responses, and that's great. And then you sort of realise, maybe you forgot to ask a question, or there's something else that you'd like to ask, or your client comes and says, "Oh, I wish we'd have asked this." Then I'm already starting to see models that can take that body of data and you can ask it a brand new question, and it will give you the responses for your entire, say, 500 sample. It will give you the responses that it thinks that 500 sample will have given to that question. So we're starting to see that already. It's not very good at the moment. Safe to say that the outputs that I've seen from it are very formulaic and predictive in terms of they're still, even with a certain amount of data, they're still responding in ways. I suppose the easiest way to put it is responding in ways that you would expect the internet to respond to a question. So you see that type of thing. I think what we'll see in the future is actual models that are able to generate actual pure AI data sets with just using the sort of the vast amount of information that's already available, and you'll be able to give them whole questionnaires and they'll be able to generate responses. I'm not holding out a huge amount of confidence at this stage as to whether or not that will be usable data. It might be beyond my lifetime, but I think not necessarily at this stage. So that's those use. The one other method that I've seen that I did actually find really, really exciting was a sort of semi-qualitative approach, which uses a chat system of feeding different answers to participants in real time. Sorry, different questions in real time. So we used it actually we did a pilot for it at the IPA, and what you give it is like a qualitative interview. You build a sort of a discussion guide with the organisation, and they feed that into the system. And you start with a single prompt question for the participant, and it's all done through sort of chat, a chat system, whether it might be text messages or it might be a live chat on their own servers, and it feeds that introduction question, and the person responds. And then what was fantastic in seeing it in the real time is how the AI system will read that response and then feed a second question that has not been set, that is just based. It says, okay, so you said you thought X, Y, and Z. Why would you say that? Or what do you think about this? And it takes the responses that have been given and it generates a brand new question, but within the framework of the discussion guide that you've given it. And I've seen that in action, and it is mind-blowing how fluent and fluid that feels to both the participant and when the responses come back, how great and cohesive and coherent, that the responses are that you get from it. So that, and we're already there at that stage, so I can only imagine sort of where that will go from there.
I started seeing that in Greece as well. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it works really well. It is really, the companies that are doing it, it's really good stuff. And you can do that at scale, so they can do that for 10,000 people, and you can do 10,000 qualitative interviews in the space of a couple of days. It's just amazing.
Amazing. I must agree, because we are doing it as well. So.
Are you doing it?
Yeah.
Ah, sorry.
So we introduced it 2 months ago, conversational AI. So it works in a similar way. You set up a goal, and then the AI has a chat with the respondent in real time. And it's amazing, just the richness of the data that comes from it.
Yeah.
It's really good. So yeah, we're really excited about it as well.
Well, and it's all sort of based on the large language models, isn't it? Which are just, and that's what I think, everybody would probably say is what we've seen, the spike in AI now is just the progression of LLMs and how just mind-blowing they are in terms of interpreting text in that way.
So we are going to quickly turn to the Q&A. Do we have any questions from our audience? Yes.
Yeah. Hello.
My name's Dan. I work at Sign Digital, which is a digital agency based in New York and London, but we're thinking of moving into out-of-home. I was wondering what your best practices are for out-of-home attribution.
Expand on what you mean. So
So potentially understanding where the best places are to set your out-of-home, and also the best way to attribute data from your out-of-home placements.
So I mean, the best source is root. So that's going to be your go-to. I mean, because that's exactly what that does. That data tells you exactly where in the country and which frames are going to hit the audience that you're looking for. And they do it exceptionally well in terms of, we were talking about their meter before, about how sophisticated the meter is that they use to track individuals. It's not just a GPS, it's an altimeter, it's a barometer. It can work inside shopping centres and tell you what level people are on and when they're travelling around and in tube stations. So that is going to give you your fundamental baseline of what the audience is for every single frame in the country. And then in terms of tracking sort of how effective that's been, I think you're turning to ad hoc research then. I think you're looking at your standard metrics as an agency to measure how effective and whether the client metrics that you're looking at have adjusted, have moved. And that's the standard stuff that you'd be doing. The other thing that we haven't really touched upon has been Origin, which I don't know if anybody has heard of Origin, but that's a sort of the new shiny toy on the block. And one of the objectives of Origin in the longer term, it's not looking at out of home just yet, but its goal will be certainly to incorporate out of home. And that is all about campaign evaluation. And that's all about finishing off the funnel of audience measurement for the JICs and the currencies, feeding through into actually tell us what was delivered and what the effectiveness of that was. So maybe further down the line, Origin will give you everything that you need, but I think at the moment it will be just your straightforward research groundwork.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Marion. So Graeme, you spoke about the journey from getting through from sort of face-to-face to where you are in terms of online and AI and whatever. Where do you stand? What is your sort of, in the way that, where is your sort of sweet spot in the way of the methodologies, but at the same time, how have you embraced AI, which I guess in our generation, possibly I say that in a hard way, but we struggle to really understand, is that giving us what face-to-face is giving us? Personally, where do you stand from a research perspective?
Well, I think, as I said, I'm always going to be a massive advocate for face-to-face. I mean, I will, till I retire, I will be a champion of face-to-face research because of just the robustness and the representativity that it can give you. But virtually nobody nowadays can afford it. So there is that reality of it's out of reach of nearly everybody. So we are going to have to embrace, just the way we embraced online research, we're going to have to embrace AI. But it's going to come at a cost, I think, of representativity, I feel. And it's going to, it will, to a certain extent, I'd use the phrase, it will homogenize outputs. So it will streamline responses, and you won't get the oddities and the beauty that we get in research, that we find when we conduct research, and that light bulb moment when you see a piece of data and you look at it and go, I was not expecting that. That, you know, we won't talk about the events of the last few days, but that kind of thing catches everybody by surprise. You know, despite all the evidence that you might have to the contrary, something will happen that will just be against everything that you imagine. And at the moment, there's nothing that I see around AI, particularly around generative AI that is producing outputs. There's nothing around that tells me that it is going to give you that difference in insight that you get from a real person. That, as I say, that you're not immune to the fact that you know, in years to come that probably will be the case, and it probably will, or will put less weight on differences, and we'll accept more homogeneity, if that's a word. So my sweet spot will be around mixed methodologies and maintaining the balance of ensuring that we've got all of those methodologies available for different approaches and different things. And you know, the stuff we were talking about AI at the moment, that stuff is going to be transformative for large-scale qualitative work. A slight aside, I remember I was sort of at the vanguard of large-scale online qual. We did a piece of work for CNN, actually, when I was at Kantar, and we broadcast a qualitative interview live to about 150 people, and we collected responses, and it was an interactive system that we built for it. And this was sort of long before online qual was a thing, and we were fortunate enough actually to be in the CNN studios as well, and I had a CNN anchor as my sort of sidekick, although I felt I was probably actually his sidekick really in the thing, because he was so professional and I was just trying to moderate a bit of a focus group. But you know, that kind of thing is in the past now. I don't feel there's necessarily a need to do any of that stuff, because the things we were talking about are going to completely supersede that and make that obsolete, because we can get there using real people, but using interactions with AI systems. And so that's probably the sweet spot, is having a hybrid of that kind of approach. And there's a great phrase, I think, about how AI is going to replace us, or you know, going to put us all out of a job. And I think there's a famous quote, and I apologise for not knowing necessarily who it was that said it, but in that you're not going to be replaced by AI, but you are probably going to be replaced by somebody that uses AI. And that's the way I think to approach it, is that you need to embrace this, and using a hybrid approach of all of these methods is going to be the best way forward.
Last one, if I may. Talking of recent surprises of the last 48 hours, why do you think pollsters got it so wrong?
So that's a really interesting question, because I certainly think over the coming days, obviously, as everybody goes through the post-mortem about why we were so out in our predictions and everybody's predictions, the pollsters will come under a lot of scrutiny, I think, for getting it so fundamentally wrong. And there's a lot of reasons, I think, why that's probably the case. Part of it is to do with America and the geography and how challenging it is for pollsters in America anyway. They couldn't really afford, some of them did do face-to-face research, but America is a really unique environment, because it's very challenging in the way that you have to approach research in America. Telephone is massive in America, and has been massive in the past. I think they've embraced online, obviously, for obvious reasons, but this disparate nature of their population makes it incredibly difficult to survey. So pollsters have that as their first hurdle generally. But I think what's fundamental about the experience that they will have gone with the US election recently is that you're talking about subjects where people aren't necessarily very keen to talk openly about their feelings and their thoughts. And you see this a lot in other types of research, particularly when you're doing face-to-face work, is that you get respondent bias naturally, and people will say what they want you to, what they think they want you to hear, you want to hear. And I think that's definitely will be the case, and that the post-mortem will come out and say that generally for probably a significant enough portion of the American population, you know, whether that's 5% of people that were interviewed, they just weren't comfortable saying that they were going to vote for Trump. And that will be at the heart of it. And so the pollsters did the best they could do, but they actually just couldn't have done anything different because the people were lying. And then that's not much a researcher can do to get past that.
So survey fraud.
Survey fraud. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, so I come from a quant, let's say, type of a background of online surveys. And I did originally have 2 questions, but you answered one of them about the compensation, which seems to be getting better now.
Yes,
The
slowly,
other,
but
thing, I guess, with quant is there's usually a target profile, and with that, we take screen outs a lot. So how does that work with face-to-face? Do you just walk out, or on phone calls, do you just hang up?
yes, yes, basically. So you'll be familiar with the Market Research Code of Conduct, and there are some quite strict guidelines about how you approach quota surveys like that, and they're very strict on making sure that you have to get your quota questions up front, early, quickly. There's no point shoving a quota question in the middle of your questionnaire. Someone's done 10 minutes and all of a sudden you have a filter question and you go, thanks, that's it, you're screened out. That's just so unfair. So you need to get those quota questions up front, and you need to make them as small, as few as possible, which obviously restricts the kind of representativity that you can apply. So it's getting that balance between those two. But ultimately, you're right. If you're knocking on doors and you're looking for a particular demographic, this is, and telephone is the same as this as well, this is really where the power of the interviewer comes in, and their art of what they do is they'll know what they're looking for, and they'll knock on the door and they will approach it in that manner. They'll either, let's say it's a straightforward, easy thing to see, and they've got a gender demographic or an age, demographic. So they're all of a sudden, age is a little bit easier because it's a little bit less political than gender, but say age. So they're looking for 15 to 24-year-olds, and a retiree opens the door. They're like, sorry, okay, thank you. I was doing a survey, but you're all right. Sorry, thank you. Or they'll say, is there anybody in the house that's 15 to 24? And they'll straight open like that. But sometimes it might be slightly more difficult to know what the qualifying criteria is, or it might require a few questions. So it is just getting them out there quickly. But yes, saying thank you, you don't qualify for this one. 9 out of 10 times the person will go, thank God, and they'll close the door and go, that's a relief. Same on the phone. They'll just say, we've got some qualifying questions. I just need to ask you a couple of things just to make sure that you're eligible. And then you'll ask a few questions and they'll go, well, sorry, in this case, you're not eligible. And they'll go, okay, thanks, goodbye. So yeah, it is just, close it off.
We have time for one more, if there is a question, or if not, we can continue. Oh, we have one. Mario?
It's a cooking recipe that we haven't cooked ourselves.
No.
In 45 seconds.
That's not fair.
1 minute and 30.
Bring out the notes.
Bring out notes. Maybe afterwards I can give you. I've got lots of recipes. I'm a big lover of cookbooks, so I would say. So I don't necessarily invent my own recipes, but I love a good cookbook and I love a Jamie Oliver recipe. I'm a massive fan of Jamie Oliver's simple, straightforward, basic cooking is just really quality stuff. So yeah, that's my go-to.
Just to say, we have a kitchen next door.
Yeah. Go knock up a little pasta for you.
You just need 5 ingredients.
Yes.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much for
Well,
this.
thank you.
I
It's
think it was
been a
great.
pleasure. I hope you enjoy it.
And yeah, thank you so much.